Dobro. History. Archive.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking you to a moment in history that is just a study in profound, almost unbelievable national schizophrenia. We're going to South Korea. The year is 1988. This is the year the country shows its gleaming, successful face to the world.
The big coming out party.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Only to have its entire moral foundation just publicly questioned, and you could argue, completely shattered by four desperate men.
It was a year of staggering cognitive dissonance. I mean, you have the government meticulously curating this image for the entire world, the miracle on the Han, successful, prosperous, democratic.
The Seoul Summer Olympics.
Right. And then just 2 weeks after that triumphal closing ceremony, that whole facade is just violently ripped away by what's known as the Ji Gang-heon hostage crisis. Some people call it the holiday incident.
And our sources are really clear on this. This isn't just a crime story.
No, not at all. It's so much deeper. Our analysis frames this as a deep psychological rupture for the nation.
Okay, so let's unpack that setup for you. 1988. This is the moment South Korea officially arrives, right? They're on the world stage. They hosted the Olympics.
A huge deal.
Huge. It's a message of unity, of entering the developed world. They're transitioning, however imperfectly, from a military dictatorship to a democracy. I mean, it is an undeniable spectacle of success. But what was actually happening just beneath that shiny surface?
Well, the facade crumbled because that success was, let's say, unequally distributed. And more importantly, it was violently enforced.
Right.
This incident gives us what our sources call a societal biopsy. It's like it puts the country under a microscope.
And what does that biopsy show?
It diagnoses the fundamental structural pathology of inequality that was just baked into the system during that messy transition from the Fifth Republic that was Chun Doo-won's military rule.
The dictator.
Yes, into the brand new democracy of the Sixth Republic under Roh Tae-woo. So the system might have looked democratic on the outside, but the foundations, the structural control, it was all still there.
And the diagnosis itself, I mean, this is the craziest part. It was screamed live into millions of homes, wasn't it? That iconic phrase that came out of this crisis.
That phrase is just. It's permanently etched into the Korean vernacular, into the national conscience. Yujin mujwai. Mujin yujwai.
Which translates to?
If you have money, you are innocent. If you have no money, you're guilty.
Wow.
And that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to analyze exactly how the state, through its economic policies and its legal structures, created the perfect conditions for that phrase to be screamed from a suburban window.
So we're diving into the legal system, state corruption, and the economic violence that ultimately made Ji Gang-heon's final desperate act. Well, in its own mind, a rational choice.
Exactly.
Okay, that perfectly frames it. Let's begin with the physical and economic context of this fracture.
Yeah.
Seoul, 1988.
The Olympics.
The Olympics. They were never just about sports. Our sources were absolutely clear. This was a massive political project. It was all about international branding, securing domestic legitimacy.
And it was started by the dictator, Chun Doo-won, and then carried through by his successor, Roh Tae-woo. And this desperate need to project a modern, clean image led to a policy they called, and this is pretty chilling, beautification.
Beautification. That sounds so benign.
It's a dangerous euphemism. I mean, in practice, it was purely structural violence. The regime just could not tolerate the presence of visible poverty.
The Panjachon. The shantytowns.
Exactly. They were all along the main roads, the main thoroughfares. They were seen as a stain on the national image, an embarrassment that had to be, systematically erased before the world's cameras arrived.
So it was social cleansing.
To put it bluntly, yes.
Yeah.
It was about removing the inconvenient reality of the economic miracle's failures.
And the most tragic and, frankly, brutal example of where this policy was implemented was the district of Sanggi-dong. This wasn't some hidden corner of Seoul, was it?
No, not at all. Sanggi-dong in northern Seoul was ground zero for this policy. Thousands of urban poor had settled there. And for many of them, this wasn't the first time they'd been displaced by development.
So they were already marginalized.
Deeply. And then when the city planners finalized the route for the Olympic torch and all the VIP motorcades, they realized, these vulnerable settlements were going to be clearly visible.
And the government's reaction was?
Extreme prejudice. They acted swiftly and ruthlessly.
Can we talk about the specifics of the forced evictions? Because our sources don't mince words here. This was state-sanctioned brutality.
It was ruthless and highly coordinated. You need to understand, this wasn't a standard legal process with notices and hearing.
No due process.
None. It was rapid, organized destruction. The construction firms, who were just salivating over these lucrative redevelopment contracts, hired specialized teams of demolition men. The sources called them thugs, or hired muscle.
And they worked with the police.
They worked directly alongside riot police. They would descend on these neighborhoods with almost no notice, tearing down homes, often while the residents were still inside, frantically trying to salvage what few belongings they had.
That's horrifying.
We're talking about families literally being buried under rubble, or having their water and electricity cut off in the middle of winter just to accelerate the clearance.
The scale of this operation is what's just staggering. How many people are we talking about here in Sanggi-dong alone?
The sheer number is heartbreaking. Our analysis points to approximately 3,000 families in Sanggi-dong.
3,000.
Just in that one district. So that represents tens of thousands of individuals. It was, as one source put it, literally burying the poor to maintain the aesthetic purity of the Olympic City.
Wow. The logic is just.
The logic was simple. Human life was secondary to the image of progress.
So the state takes away your physical home? But then what? What happens to your ability to find a new one? The economic fallout must have been devastating.
It was a trap, a complete trap.
Yeah.
Because the very development that drove the evictions also drove the surrounding housing market into absolute chaos.
Speculation.
Massive speculation, the Olympic excitement, the influx of capital. It caused housing prices in any alternative residential areas to just skyrocket. We're talking sometimes by nearly 500% in just a few years.
So for these thousands of newly homeless families who had no savings, no land titles,
finding another place to live became impossible. It was completely out of reach.
So they couldn't afford to stay nearby. They couldn't afford to move far away. Where did they go? What happened to them?
They were pushed to the absolute fringes of society. Many were forced out to remote, completely undeveloped areas, sometimes referred to as deserted orchards.
Oh my God.
Or, and get this, they resorted to digging makeshift dwellings into hidden embankments, meticulously concealed from the main highways.
To stay invisible.
To make sure they were invisible to the celebratory gaze of the new Korea. And this is a critical point for our story. Ji Gang-heon and his fellow escapees came directly from this marginalized, predatory environment.
So they didn't see the state as a protector.
They saw it as a predator, a systematic destroyer of their lives and their livelihoods.
And if that physical and economic violence was displacement, the psychological violence was coming from the other side of the government strategy.
The distraction policy.
Let's talk about the Chun regime's 3S policy.
This was a really calculated authoritarian maneuver. The 3S stood for sports, sex, and screen. The goal was to actively depoliticize the population.
Keep them distracted.
Exactly. Divert their attention away from the political repression, the labor exploitation, the corruption that was running rampant. And they did this by promoting professional sports leagues like baseball and soccer, relaxing censorship on erotic films.
And pushing for color TV.
Yes, the saturation of color television sets into every home.
It sounds like a very early government-sponsored version of bread and circuses.
It's a perfect analogy. Keep them entertained, keep them focused on leisure, and they won't look too closely at the repression. But for the lower classes, especially those, confined to prison or displaced by the Olympics, the policy backfired spectacularly.
On a psychological level.
Completely. It created this profound, crushing sense of what sociologists call relative deprivation.
So by showing them everything they couldn't have.
Precisely. By saturating the culture with these ubiquitous images of luxury, affluence, and leisure all broadcast in vivid color on those new TVs, the policy just highlighted the insurmountable gulf between the celebrated Korean miracle and the grim reality that they were facing.
For prisoners like Ji Gang-heon, who are behind bars for minor theft.
Yes, the constant visual reminder of what they could never, ever have created, this incredibly volatile psychological pressure cooker. It made their desperation feel not just real, but entirely justified.
So that's the context. You have this simmering pot of economic despair and psychological pressure.
And then the legal system comes along and clamps the lid on tight.
Right. So if the socioeconomic context provided the volatility, our sources say the direct catalyst for the escape was the legal mechanism that ensured the poor stayed poor and, incarcerated.
The Social Protection Act, or SBA. This act, established in 1980, was a direct and horrifying relic of the military junta, and it essentially enshrined inequality right into the penal code.
Okay, so this law was already 8 years old by 1988. Was it specifically designed to institutionalize inequality from the start, or did it have a different purpose?
That's a crucial question. Officially, on paper, the SBA's purpose was rehabilitation. It was a preventative measure against criminals at high risk of recidivism.
That sounds reasonable enough.
It does, but its real function was political control and societal warehousing. Under the Fifth Republic, these kinds of preventative detention laws were first used very aggressively against perceived political dissidents.
Labor organizers, student protesters.
All of them. But once the democratic transition began to force the release of a lot of those political prisoners, the law's focus pivoted sharply.
How so?
It became a mechanism to keep the economic casualties of rapid development locked up. Petty thieves, habitual offenders, the marginalized, anyone who was an eyesore. It was a way to institutionalize inequality and just remove them from public sight.
So it was a tool that transitioned from political repression to class repression.
Perfectly put.
And this is where this shocking concept of double jeopardy comes into play. I mean, this fundamentally destroys the integrity of a judicial sentence.
Absolutely. Think about how the legal process should work. A person, let's use Ji Gang-heon as our example, would receive and complete his standard judicial sentence. Let's say it was 7 years for theft. In any normal functioning legal system, once that time is served, you're free, you've paid your debt to society.
But not under the SPA.
Under the SPA, that was not the case. Instead of being released, they were immediately transferred to something called a protection facility.
Which was basically just another prison.
Yes. Often functionally indistinguishable from a maximum security prison. High walls, guards, the whole thing. And their incarceration just continued. For an additional administrative period, usually set at another 7 to 10 years. Sometimes longer.
And this extra time.
Yeah.
It wasn't for a new crime they committed.
No, and this is the critical point. This extension was not based on the commission of a new crime. It was based purely on an administrative determination of their future, theoretical risk of recidivism.
That sounds terrifyingly arbitrary. Who was making this determination and on what legal basis? It sounds like they were just sidestepping the courts completely.
They were. The system violated the most fundamental constitutional principles. The custody extension was decided by a body called the Community Protection Committee.
Which was not a court.
It was an executive administrative body. They operated entirely outside the rigorous evidentiary standards and due process of a criminal court.
Which is a constitutional violation.
A direct violation of Article 27 of the Constitution, the enshrined right to a trial by a judge before your liberty is taken away. The judicial sentence, which they had paid in full, became totally irrelevant. The administrative order was the real sentence, and it often doubled or tripled the time they served.
And the sources suggest this didn't just bypass the right to a judge, it destroyed the prisoners psychologically.
Because it offered no hope, no end date.
It's a violation of human dignity.
Exactly, a violation of Article 10, relating to human dignity and the pursuit of happiness. The sheer hopelessness of indefinite detention is psychologically devastating. And the criteria for determining this risk were entirely subjective and, inherently penalized the poor.
How so?
They focused heavily on patterns of economic crimes associated with desperation. Repeated small thefts, homelessness, persistent poverty. If you stole a few loaves of bread repeatedly because you were starving, you were labeled a habitual criminal requiring segregation.
Regardless of the value of what was stolen.
Exactly. The system ensured that for the poor, the door to freedom was just perpetually locked.
And this brings us right back to Ji Gang-heon's case, which is just the perfect, tragic example of this institutionalized cruelty. Let's look at his specific math again.
Right. So Ji was sentenced to 7 years for a theft totaling approximately 5.5 million Korean won.
Which was about, $5,000–6,000 US at the time?
Roughly, yes. A significant property crime for sure, but one that came with the defined end date. But then the Social Protection Act administratively imposed an additional 10 years of protective custody.
So 7 plus 10. You're looking at a 17-year loss of freedom for that single offense.
It's staggering. The analytical sources correctly identify this as a life sentence on the installment plan.
Where the debt is never truly paid.
Exactly. When you look at those numbers, you really start to understand the depth of his despair. If the legal system guarantees you cannot regain your freedom regardless of serving your time,
then the decision to escape, even knowing it might be fatal,
It begins to seem like the only way to assert any final control over your own fate. It transforms an otherwise desperate act into a form of political protest. The state had nullified his future. Obeying the law was pointless. His freedom wasn't contingent on his behavior or rehabilitation.
It was contingent on an administrative panel deciding he was rich enough not to steal again.
It was a law predicated on class status, pure and simple.
So the Social Protection Act created this volatile environment, this hopeless confinement for the poor. But the immediate visceral spark that turned that hopelessness into outright rage was the sheer open corruption of the country's elite.
And it was highlighted by a massive scandal involving the former president's own family.
This is where the hypocrisy just becomes too blatant to ignore.
It is. In early 1988, just as the country is celebrating its democratic transition, investigations began into Chun Kung-hwan.
The younger brother of the former dictator, Chun Doo-hwan.
Correct. And his position was incredibly significant. He was the chancellor of the Semol-Undong movement.
So for our listeners, can you briefly explain what the Semol-Undong was? Why was his position so important, especially in the context of the poor?
Absolutely. The Semol-Undong, or the New Community Movement, was this massive nationwide initiative. It was launched in the 70s and 80s, and officially its goal was to alleviate poverty and modernize rural South Korea.
So it was a development program.
A huge one. It received enormous state funding and was championed as a symbol of Korean self-reliance. For Chun Kung-hwan to be the head of it meant he controlled billions of won, meant specifically for the nation's most vulnerable populations.
The very same populations that Ji Gang-heon and others came from.
Exactly. So the corruption wasn't just stealing from the state, it was stealing directly from poverty alleviation programs.
What was the scale of his embezzlement? I mean, how much are we talking about?
The scale was astronomical. It just reflected a complete and total disregard for public funds. He was charged with embezzling state money, soliciting bribes, widespread tax evasion.
And the numbers?
The initial official charges were around 7 billion KRW. But broader estimates, when you look at all the funds associated with his corruption, they reached upwards of 76 billion KRW.
So tens of millions of dollars at the time.
Yes. All of it funneled into personal real estate, overseas accounts, luxury living. He essentially treated the national treasury as his own personal, limitless slush fund.
The disparity is sickening. It really is. So you have Ji Gang-heon facing 17 years for stealing $5,000.
Most of which was due to an administrative law.
And Chun Kung-hwan stealing, what, 10,000 times that amount? Let's use the data from the source synthesis to really highlight this asymmetry of justice. This is what galvanized the inmates.
They were reading about this in newspapers, smuggled into the facilities. They made the comparison themselves. Ji Gang-heon, theft of 5.5 million KRW, 17 years.
Okay.
Chun Kung-hwan, embezzlement of 7 billion plus KRW, sentenced to just 7 years.
Just 7.
The raw numbers show a clear institutional bias. The law was harsh, but only when it was applied downwards.
But the outrage wasn't just about the initial sentence, was it? It was about how justice was actually carried out. That's what revealed the system's true allegiance.
That's the key betrayal. The poor man gets the full, crushing weight of the administrative law, while the powerful man gets a sweetheart deal. Chun Kung-hwan was sentenced in 1989, but, due to political maneuvering and this perceived need for national reconciliation,
he served almost no time.
He served only about 3 years. He was released on parole in 1991 and then received a full presidential pardon in 1997.
So he stole astronomical sums and walked free after a fraction of his sentence.
3 years of, I'm sure, very soft detention for a multi-million-dollar plunder versus a 17-year sentence, essentially a life sentence for a man who stole just enough to survive. That comparison, it must have just solidified the rage among the inmates.
It did more than that.
It didn't just solidify rage, it transformed their identity. That realization that the law was a flexible instrument based entirely on your social standing, it meant the system itself was morally bankrupt.
So Ji Gang-heon wasn't just a petty thief anymore.
In his own mind, no. He became a political insurgent whose only real crime was being poor. The actions of the Chun family confirmed every single suspicion that money guarantees innocence. It was the living proof of 유지은무죄.
So on October 8th, 1988, this volatile cocktail of hopelessness from the SPA and pure rage from the Chun scandal, it finally boils over.
It reaches its boiling point.
Take us through the logistics of the breakout.
The escape happened on a prison transport bus. It was traveling on the Gyeongbu Expressway near Ansong, moving 25 inmates.
And they somehow got out of their handcuffs.
The sources suggest the timing is calculated. The inmates managed to compromise their handcuffs. This wasn't some complex high-tech plan. It was likely concealed, simple tools or just exploiting worn, older mechanisms on the cuffs during the long journey.
And they overpowered the guards and took control of the bus. But out of 25 inmates, only 12 chose to flee.
Right.
Why did more than half of them stay behind?
And this is the grim reality of the STA in action. The remaining 13 inmates were paralyzed by fear.
Fear of the consequences.
They calculated that even if they escaped for a little while, the repercussions under the Social Protection Act would be so severe, potentially doubling their protective custody or just locking them away indefinitely, that it just wasn't worth the risk. The 12 who fled were the ones who truly felt they had reached a state of existential nothingness. They had nothing left to lose.
That fear is just a testament to the power of that administrative law. So the core group that remained at large over the next week quickly dwindled down to 4.
Yes, Ji Gang-heon, An Kwang-sul, Kang Young-yeol, and Han Ich-chul. And as this massive manhunt ensued, a completely unexpected narrative started to take hold in the media.
Right, because the state's reaction was predictable.
Oh, totally. The state did what any authoritarian-leaning government would do. They immediately labeled the fugitives as heinous, dangerous beasts trying to instill public fear. But the reality, reported by the families they encountered during their week-long flight, powerfully countered that narrative.
These were families whose homes the fugitives invaded for shelter or food or cash. So what did they report?
They reported politeness.
Politeness.
The men would bow, they would apologize profusely for the intrusion, and they often explained their predicament. There are anecdotal reports of them sharing meals with the hostages and ensuring they didn't take excessively.
So they weren't on a violent rampage.
No, they were focused on basic survival, not wanton violence. They were, surprisingly, exhibiting more social decorum than the state had shown to the displaced poor in Sengidong.
And they were actively trying to control their own public image, to reframe the narrative. That's a pretty sophisticated move for desperate men on the run.
It was crucial to them. They used these hostage situations as a kind of pulpit. They would detail their personal plight, the sheer injustice of the protective custody system, and they specifically pointed to the blatant, unpunished corruption of the Chun family.
So they weren't just fleeing, they were demanding validation.
And understanding from the public.
And this strategy resonated powerfully. They quickly became seen as this modern incarnation of the noble bandit archetype.
Exactly. Like figures from Korean folklore, like the 16th century outlaw 𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐏, who stole from the corrupt rich to give to the poor.
So the public narrative shifted from dangerous criminals to victims of a rigged system.
Yes, the public sympathy grew precisely because the fugitives' conduct was perceived as being more morally clear than the justice system that was hunting them.
So the polite conduct of Ji Gang-heon and his crew became, ironically, the most effective moral critique of the state they could have possibly launched.
It forced the public to ask a really uncomfortable question. If the criminals are the polite ones, what does that say about the law?
And the government, caught between the afterglow of the Olympics and this growing public sympathy, they must have been desperate to end this standoff.
They were panicking. Every single day these men were free, confirming the public's worst suspicions about state corruption was a major legitimacy crisis for the new democratic government. They were under intense pressure to neutralize the threat, both physically and narratively, as quickly and as decisively as possible.
And this dramatic, week-long pursuit finally culminates, so tragically, on October 16, 1988, in the quiet Seoul neighborhood of Bugajwadong. Let's set the stage for this final act, which really became national television theater.
The environment itself kind of set a somber mood. Historical records confirm it was a cold, overcast, damp autumn day, just perfect for televised gloom.
And Ji Gang-heon's group, now down to 4, they infiltrated the home of a Mr. Ko Young-soo in the early morning hours.
Right. And that infiltration turned into this bizarre, almost domestic waiting game, didn't it?
It did. They took the family hostage. But the most striking detail is that they proceeded to drink the family's soju and critically watched the live news reports about the manhunt on the family's TV.
They were consuming the narrative of their own demise, watching themselves being hunted in real time. It suggests a calculated attempt to witness the end of their own story.
Or maybe a final desperate hope that the public sympathy they'd cultivated might somehow materialize into some form of protection.
Could be. But it was Mr. Ko Young-soo who managed to slip out and alert the police around 4 a.m., and that's when the siege began.
And the neighborhood was transformed into a military zone.
The state's response was massive. It reflected the political urgency of the situation. Over 1,000 personnel police, riot squads, SWAT teams, snipers, they established this heavy perimeter.
And the media was right there.
A huge media presence. Satellite trucks deploying to broadcast the entire standoff live. It turned this quiet suburban street into national anxiety-ridden theater from dawn onward.
And the siege dragged on for hours. Yeah. But around noon, there was this pivotal moment involving the youngest member of the group, Kang Young-il.
This is a moment of profound moral complexity. Kang Young-il, the youngest man in the house, he exited around noon. When he tried to go back in, Ji Gang-heon physically prevented him from re-entering.
And pushed him away.
Pushed him away and effectively forced him into police custody. The sources really suggest that Ji, knowing that a violent end or suicide pact was forming inside, intentionally saved the youngest member's life.
He forced him to face the SPA, rather than the certain death awaiting the rest of them.
It was his last moral choice in a system that had denied him all others.
And as the police closed in, Ji Gang-heon made his final, very famous request. He wanted to hear the song Holiday.
And this request created one of the most persistent cultural myths of the entire incident. It was largely popularized by the 2006 film, also called Holiday.
Right. The movie dramatized the idea that the police, being completely out of touch, mistakenly played the wrong song.
Exactly. The myth is that they played the German hard rock band Scorpions' Holiday instead of the requested Bees' orchestral pop version.
And the historical analysis suggests he listened to the correct track. The Bee Gees version.
It does. It was likely provided by the hostage family or correctly sourced by the police, and the lyrics of the Bee Gees version are far, far more relevant to his state of mind.
How so?
The Bee Gees' Holiday is this haunting, melancholic track, and its lyrics speak directly to existential despair and manipulated reality. There's a line. It's something I think's worthwhile. If the puppet makes you smile, if not, then you're throwing stones.
He saw himself as the puppet.
He was positioning himself as the puppet, a victim of a society that only valued him as a spectacle, now facing the stones, the inevitable violence of the powerful state he critiqued. The song was his final, tragic soundtrack.
And with that music playing, we get the indelible image of the entire crisis, the moment that defined the inequality debate for the next generation.
Ji Gang-heon stands at the window, a desperate figure holding a shard of broken glass to his own throat. It's a visceral symbol of self-inflicted judgment. And this was the moment he screamed his final, devastating verdict, broadcast live to the entire nation.
He raged against the blatant protection afforded to the Chun family, while the law systematically oppressed the poor. The end came swiftly and violently after that.
Inside, An Kwang-sul and Han Chul committed suicide. They used seized firearms to avoid capture and the inescapable fate of the SPA. Ji attempted to follow suit, slashing his throat with the glass.
And the police moved in.
Police snipers then opened fire as they stormed the room. He died hours later from his wounds and blood loss at the hospital, having secured his legacy in the most horrific way possible.
So Ji Gang-heon's death, it didn't silence his message at all. It amplified it exponentially. The tragic spectacle forced a national reckoning with the structural violence inherent in the South Korean legal system. But this wasn't an immediate fix, was it? What was the immediate legal and political fallout?
The pressure was immense. The Roh Tae-woo administration, which was trying to solidify its democratic legitimacy, just couldn't ignore the public narrative. While the police were praised for ending the siege, the focus immediately shifted to the root cause, the Social Protection Act.
So human rights organizations jumped on this.
They were galvanized by the public sympathy for the polite bandits. They launched these sustained campaigns, flooding the courts and the media with analyses citing the obvious violation of the right to trial, the principle of double jeopardy.
A fundamental inhumanity of it all.
Yes, of indefinite administrative detention.
Did the government try to reform it immediately, or did they just try to ride out the storm?
They tried to ride it out initially. There were promises of reform, promises of review, but structural change is difficult, especially when the law serves the powerful.
Right.
The critique Ji Gang-heon delivered was a direct assault on the legal structures put in place by the military regime, and those structures had powerful defenders who benefited from, warehousing the poor. So the wheels of legal change ground agonizingly slowly.
But the ultimate delayed victory did come. Years later.
Yeah.
When was the Social Protection Act finally abolished?
The law was not abolished until 2005.
2005. That's 17 long years after the incident.
It is. And that timeline is so crucial because it demonstrates the entrenched power of the system Ji was protesting against. It took nearly 2 decades of sustained legal and political pressure, a direct but excruciatingly delayed victory for the critique he launched with his life to finally dismantle that relic of the military junta.
And to fully grasp the enduring power of his final scream, we really have to contrast his fate with the fate of the men whose corruption he protested.
This is the bitterest legacy, the real proof of 𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐏.
The living testament.
Let's track the trajectory of the Chun family, the source of that initial outrage. Chun Kung-han, the president's brother who embezzled colossal sums from the poor, was sentenced to 7 years in 1989.
And he served.
He served only a few years. He was released on parole in 1991 and then received a full presidential pardon in 1997. He walked free and lived in comfort.
And his older brother, the former dictator Chun Doo-hwan himself?
He was sentenced to death for his role in the Gwangju massacre and for corruption. That sentence was commuted, and ultimately, he was fully pardoned in 1997, again under this umbrella of national reconciliation.
And he never paid his fines.
When he died in 2021, he had famously never paid the full financial penalties levied against him by the courts. He maintained this notorious claim that he had only 290,000 won to his name.
While living in undeniable luxury.
Yes. For the Korean public, the immunity enjoyed by the Chun family served as daily, decades-long proof that money bought complete legal impunity.
And that pattern, powerful figures receiving light sentences or pardons for catastrophic financial crimes, that's precisely what Ji Gang-heon's image became shorthand for.
Yes. For class warfare, it still reverberates through modern culture.
It absolutely permeates modern Korean visual culture. The man at the window holding a shard of glass became an instant icon.
And beyond the direct dramatizations like the 2006 film Holiday, which, despite the factual inaccuracy about the music, it effectively cemented that image of state disconnect. The motifs have evolved into more abstract critiques of inequality.
Let's talk about that. How has this legacy shown up in contemporary media? The global success of Squid Game felt like a modern channeling of that same desperate ethos of 1988.
It's undeniable. Squid Game uses several powerful echoes of the 1988 crisis. You see the desperate characters in tracksuits symbolizing the marginalized masses.
The glass shard.
The motif of the glass shard symbolizing sudden, brutal, existential danger. And the entire premise, desperate players fighting to the death in a system they know is inherently rigged, where money is the ultimate prize. The only distinction between innocence and guilt
is a direct, powerful reflection of the 𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐏 theme.
The narrative is simply updated for the 21st century capitalist playground.
Yeah, and we see it in other genres too, right? Like in critiques of social hierarchy in youth dramas.
Yes. You see dramas like Weak Hero Class 2 using the tracksuit gang aesthetic, not just as simple criminal attire, but as a visual shorthand for the underclass fighting against overwhelming, structurally powerful forces. It signals economic violence and social stratification. The cultural memory of 1988 is a lens through which new critiques of wealth and power are still filtered.
And finally, there's the meta-critique. The analysis of analyzing the trauma itself.
That's the most recent evolution. Sources reference later documentaries like The Echoes of Survivors, which revisit these tragedies. And while they analyze the lengths people will go to for money and the systemic failures, they raise an important ethical question for you, the viewer.
Which is?
Is the constant reenactment of this historical suffering truly serving justice by maintaining memory? Or is it just becoming trauma porn, a form of commercial exploitation of the victim's pain for entertainment?
It forces us, the consumers of history, to question our responsibility.
Our responsibility to the victims of structural violence?
So what does this entire comprehensive deep dive mean for you, the listener? We started with the extreme cognitive dissonance of 1988. The Ji Gang-heon crisis served as this profound societal biopsy that exposed the massive human cost underpinning South Korea's celebrated modernization.
It did.
The poor were literally forced out, their homes bulldozed, just to maintain the aesthetic purity required for the Olympic Games.
The incident proved that the foundation of the South Korean economic miracle was built on structural violence and a selective class-based application of the law. And that phrase, 𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐏, It didn't fade away.
No, it became permanently embedded in the vernacular.
It's a powerful, instantaneous slogan that is resurrected today every single time powerful figures like the heads of major cable, the giant family-run conglomerates receive suspended sentences or minimal fines or executive pardons for massive financial crimes.
The victory of abolishing the Social Protection Act was a crucial, necessary step, even though it was delayed by 17 years. But the deeper cultural impact was immediate. The public understanding of systemic inequality was permanently altered.
And that is the final thought for you to carry forward. Ji Gang-heon died in 1988, but the ghost of that man holding the glass shard still absolutely haunts the courtrooms and legislative assemblies of Seoul.
It's a powerful image.
And the analytical sources suggest a profound truth. A society's worth is ultimately measured not by its Olympic medals or its technological prowess or its GDP figures, but by the dignity and equity it affords to its most desperate and powerless citizens.
So the question remains.
What fundamental legal, economic, or social reforms would be required in any modern state for the law to truly protect the powerless as equally as it protects the powerful? That question, screamed on a cold autumn day, remains unanswered.